Bottom of the hour, the top of the news now, the Russians suspected of supplying the Taliban with weapons. That's what a top U.S. commander told Congress today.
It's fair to assume they may be providing some kind of support to them in terms of weapons or other things that may be there. I think that is the possibility. I believe what Russia is attempting to do is they are attempting to be an influential party in this part of the world.
And that's not all. Last week, NATO's supreme allied commander and the top U.S. general in Europe made a very similar accusation. Think of the big picture here. The Taliban targets American troops. The Taliban is trying to kill our people. And the accusation is the Russians are supporting the Taliban. The Kremlin, of course, is pushing back. A spokesperson for the defense minister telling Russian state media that Moscow has had no cooperation with organizations recognized as terrorists by the United Nations. But the question remains, were the Russians helping the Taliban as the Taliban try to kill American troops? Garrett Tenney with the news. He's live in Washington. Garrett, why would Russia help the Taliban?
Well, Russia is really coming full circle here, Shep. After all, what we know as the Taliban today started with some of the same fighters that helped drive out the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in the 1980s with training in weapons from the CIA. Now, almost 30 years later, the tables have turned, and U.S. military leaders believe Russia is now likely providing the Taliban with supplies and weapons in the fight against U.S.-backed fighters. Today, General Votel, who is the head of the U.S. Central Command, said he believes ISIS and the Kremlin's desire to stop its spread into Central Asia is a big reason why. Votel told the House Armed Services Committee the Kremlin has likely determined the Taliban has a better shot at tackling ISIS than the country's current government, which is also backed by the West.
And so they have created a narrative that you really have to partner more with the Taliban to address this particular threat. And they are trying to leverage that into a bigger role in terms of, I think, trying to pursue peace agreements and other things with the Taliban. Frankly, I don't consider it to be particularly helpful at this particular point.
And what adds to the concerns of U.S. leaders is that Afghanistan is only the latest Middle Eastern country where Russia is attempting to expand its influence and aligning itself with anti-American forces. Shep.
If the Russians are in fact helping supply the Taliban, then do the Americans change our strategy, did he say?
Well, for right now, they said no, and they said that it won't have much of an impact on our strategy. They admit, though, that currently Afghanistan is essentially at a stalemate, and it'll take a couple thousand more troops in the country in order to change that. Shep.
Garrett Tenney in D.C., thanks.
Coalition forces in Iraq pounding ISIS. Over 2,000 precision-guided bombs targeting ISIS fighters in Mosul during March. More than 500 a week. The top U.S. Air Force general in Iraq calling the airstrikes the most kinetic phase of the air war so far. Iraq's prime minister now saying it's only a matter of weeks before they defeat ISIS on the battlefield. Senate Armed Forces Chairman John McCain weighing in on the timeline.
I am satisfied that we're on the right track. We're using the right assets. We are increasing the latitude of the military commanders to take action as the situation warrants. We are devoting sufficient assets and a strategy that General Mattis and General Dunford are developing.
Jillian Turner is a former member of the White House National Security Council staff under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and is now a vice president of Jones Group International, and is a Fox News contributor. An all-around busy person, Jillian. Good to have you here. So let's get first to this. This top Air Force general saying Mosul airstrikes mark the most kinetic phase of the ISIS air war so far. Sounds like progress.
Yeah, I think it definitely does sound like progress. And for the most part, I agree with what Senator McCain, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, just said in that clip. But I would just point out to some folks who are probably wondering the same thing I thought when I heard that is, how can General Mattis and Secretary Tillerson and other military advisors to the president are in the process still of putting this anti-ISIS strategy together. So how can we be carrying out a strategy that hasn't been finalized or approved by the president yet? So that was a little strange.
And then, I mean, to John McCain's point, he was basically saying he agrees with what's going on here. We're using the right assets. We're increasing the latitude of military commanders.
Right.
He had a laundry list of things that he agrees with and likes that he's seeing, but he did talk about the strategy is not fully developed yet.
Right. So he's sort of saying we like the direction this is going. But from my perspective, it's not markedly different from the Obama administration strategy in the sense that the United States Armed Forces that are there on the ground are really still touting themselves as support forces. They're trying to shape the battleground inside Mosul. They're trying to support the Iraqi forces that are there. We're still relying on Kurdish-born fighters to help fight ISIS. We haven't really gone all in on a ground war, which is one of the only ways that a strategy could be markedly different. So it's unclear to me exactly where we're going to end up here, but hopefully we'll get to see the strategy very soon.
But when you bring it all back to the timeline, especially the one that the Iraqi prime minister is laying out here, saying that it's a matter of weeks to defeat ISIS militarily.
I hope so. We've been going at it in Mosul for 6 months now. It looks like, you know, the United States presence there did a lot to help with eastern Mosul. We're now focused on western Mosul. The problem, as always, is that ISIS is remarkably adaptive. And what they're doing on the ground now is largely responsible for these huge civilian casualty numbers I saw you were talking about earlier. We're seeing so many civilian casualties because they're making sure it happens. They're constantly figuring out new ways to make sure that the most vulnerable members of society are targeted and killed. And that's kind of their calling card all around the world.
So let's talk about some of the changes that we are seeing under President Donald Trump. He's added this well-respected Russia scholar. Her name is Fiona Hill. She's joining the White House National Security Council as Senior Director for Europe and Russia, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, former member of the National Intelligence Council. She was first recruited for the NSC job under Michael Flynn, and frequent critic of President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Jillian, what do you make of this addition?
I feel really good about it. The first tip of the hat to her is that she has remained, for most of her career, very critical and I would say skeptical of the Putin regime, as well she should be. So it's in the midst of all of this scandal and controversy about Trump administration potential ties to Russia, it's nice to see them bringing in somebody who is very much not in that camp and will provide an alternate point of view or her own point of view to the president. I will say it's also interesting that she's going to be the senior director for Russia and Europe, because in previous administrations, Bush and Obama, that was not the case. Those were two separate positions. So I think there's a bit of an acknowledgement here that the two issues are interrelated. We're going to have to work closely with Europe, with the EU and the UK and NATO in order to combat the threat that Russia poses to us. So I like all of that. And I would also add that it looks like she had previous experience at the NIC, the National Intelligence Council. All right. Anyone who comes out of there is A-OK in my book.
There you go. All right. Jillian Turner gives her a thumbs up. All right. Thanks for joining.
Fox News alert on the fight to defeat ISIS, with Iraqi forces making progress in the battle to recapture Mosul, the country's second largest city. Troops now tightening control around a landmark site, the mosque where ISIS proclaimed the caliphate nearly 3 years ago. But this comes as concerns mount about civilian casualties. Benjamin Halla is following the breaking developments from London. Benjamin.
Yeah, hi, Melissa. Civilian casualties certainly are on the rise at the moment. That's in large part because the fight has moved into the old city, where the streets are smaller, the civilians are packed in, and ISIS very much using them as human shields. But on the 17th of March, a tragic error, as a coalition airstrike is said to have killed over 200 civilians. The US has now opened an investigation and concluded that while it was indeed a coalition bomb, ISIS made it far worse by forcing civilians into that building, placing fighters on the roof and booby-trapping it to assure mass casualties. It's another reminder that it's civilians in the middle of this increasingly bloody battle. The battle for Mosul is now being fought house to house, and ISIS has spent 2.5 years preparing the defenses. Booby traps, snipers, tunnels. Those who consider escaping the city face being killed by ISIS. Those who stay face being killed by ISIS. In the air, helicopter gunships are now supplying much of the cover instead of the high-altitude bombers. And now, forces are moving ever closer to the next main target, the famous Al-Nouri Mosque, from where ISIS leader Baghdadi first declared the caliphate. In other disturbing news, a video released by ISIS shows children, armed with weapons, training to clear houses, using live targets. We can't show all of the scenes. Safe to say at the end, the children execute bound men. Now, ISIS, from their very inception, have been brainwashing children, training them how to kill. And one of the great worries now is that a whole generation of Iraqis knows nothing but the brutality of the terror group. And moving forward, surely that is going to be another major concern. Melissa?
Wow. Benjamin Hall, thank you for that report.
And Melissa, we have some new information on ISIS and the danger it may pose to one of our NATO allies. After we just heard from Benjamin about the progress in retaking Mosul from the terrorist group, a new report finds that the Islamic State is gaining a foothold in Turkey, as you know, a key NATO ally. This is Secretary of State Rex Tillerson heads to that country today, and counterterrorism and taking the fight to the radical Islamic terrorists expected to be top of his agenda. Jonathan Schanzer joins us now. He co-authored the report on Turkey and is also the Vice President of Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a former terrorism analyst at the Treasury Department. So, Jonathan, first off, what you outlined in your report, I mean, it's alarming. You got a NATO ally hit by, well, like 30 terrorist attacks, killing more than 300 people, and you say that Turkey has a substantial threat by ISIS to that country. So then what is the result for us?
Well, the result is that we're seeing a key Muslim country that has served as a buffer against terrorists, against ISIS. It appears to be eroding. I believe that really this is the result of disastrous policies carried out by the Erdogan government, the current government in Turkey. They tried to topple Bashar al-Assad in Syria by allowing jihadists to cross their border. And in so doing, for many years, they allowed ISIS to essentially nestle into Turkish society. And over the last 3 years or so, we've seen a significant uptick in ISIS activity, and including attacks against this crucial NATO ally.
Yeah, you mentioned President Erdogan. I mean, he had an open door. It was an open gate to Islamic recruits. The foreign fighters would just flood right over his border. They basically didn't do anything. Remember the siege of Kobani a couple of years ago when the Turkish tanks just sat on the border like bystanders? Let me read a comment about that from your report. You say, quote, "Since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, Turkey's indifference towards and even tacit support for IS, Islamic State, and other jihadists has alarmed its Western allies, particularly the United States. Knowingly or not, Turkey allowed the IS and other jihadist groups to establish their cells in Istanbul, Ankara, and other Turkish cities near the Syrian border. Beyond their physical networks in Turkey, the jihadists' online presence in Turkish is growing. Indeed, social media has become the top recruiting platform, and other tech-savvy extremist groups. And while Turkey has imposed draconian media laws, Ankara's online crackdown on jihadists remains relatively meek." So if they're not doing enough, this blowback certainly has and will continue to hit them.
That's right. And actually what we've seen is in the 81 provinces across Turkey, there have been counterterrorism actions taken in 54 of them. So in other words, we're really seeing more than half the territory across Turkey that has been infiltrated by ISIS to some extent. There have been something like 1,300 arrests, but this is really the shocking figure, is that only 7 convictions have come out of those 1,300. So you have that online problem that we mentioned in the report, the ongoing ISIS sort of activity, and then the Turkish government cracking down instead of against ISIS, they're cracking down on their own political dissidents in a very fraught political environment.
So finally, Rex Tillerson will be in Turkey, meeting with government officials. What can we do? What should he say? What type of steps can be taken to try and push back the Islamists?
Well, the key here right now is to offer the Turks a range of U.S. support. So we can help crack down on the online recruitment. We can ensure that the Turks have better security on its border. We need to really have the Turks take care of their Kurdish problem. We think that that has really probably been detracting from some of the counterterrorism activities that they should be involved in. But if we see that the Turks are not interested in cracking down on ISIS the way we suggest, then I think we need to make it clear that we're willing to downgrade the relationship. We don't want to lose this relationship, but we need to renegotiate the terms because this is such a crucial NATO ally and they are really falling down on the job.
Yeah, they certainly have not done enough. Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much. I want to urge our viewers, for more information on this, all you have to do is go to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies website. You can download and read the whole report, and it is worthy reading as we fight and face radical Islamic terrorism. Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, drug tunnels under the border. Mexican cartels have dug them to funnel their product into our country. After police find them, the tunnels are then filled in with cement, but that only happens on the U.S. side. And guess what? The cartels, well, they've started to reuse the tunnels on the Mexican side of the border. Will Carr has more on this from Los Angeles. Hi, Will.
Hey there, Eric, and we wanted to see just how easy it is to access tunnels in Mexico that have already been discovered by law enforcement. So we went to Tijuana and found a major lapse in border security. Every time authorities find a tunnel burrowed under the border fence, American law enforcement fills the entire U.S. side of the tunnel with concrete.
It's done with every tunnel in order to deter anyone to use it ever again.
But on the other side of the border, Mexican authorities say filling their end is too expensive, so they leave discovered tunnels open underground. In the back of an empty Tijuana warehouse, we found a tunnel covered by a steel slab. Underneath, though, it's still hollow, allowing the cartels to get back in and reuse the drug portal, saving time and money. When the cartels get back into the tunnels, they can actually physically walk all the way up to the U.S. border where it's sealed, and that's when they can start tunneling around.
There's been at least 7 documented incidents where that has actually happened.
It's a major frustration for American authorities who spend millions to discover and then shut tunnels down. We check it out. In Mexico, it's a different story. We were able to walk up to one tunnel entrance after another, finding that security is lax or non-existent. Some left unguarded, others watched over by guards who claim to be paid by the government. How many tunnels do you think are in this neighborhood? 6. 6 tunnels in this neighborhood. That's a lot. How concerned are you for your own safety? The cartels are going to try to come back to this tunnel.
It's okay, if the cartel comes back, I'm not going to fight them. It's going to come right in.
An open invitation the cartels will continue to exploit. American authorities tell us they use a combination of technology and information from surrounding communities to find and shut tunnels down. Eric.
You know, that's unbelievable, Will. I mean, why don't we give them cement so that they could cement their side of the tunnel? I mean, how about that?
That's a good idea.
For a possibility. Well, we'll see. Thank you.
It's official. The United Kingdom is starting its divorce proceedings from the European Union. Prime Minister Theresa May sending a letter to European Council President Donald Tusk this morning, formally triggering Article 50 that started negotiations for the so-called Brexit.
I want us to be a truly global Britain, the best friend and neighbour to our European partners, but a country that reaches beyond the borders of Europe too.
Despite May's conciliatory tone, the British government showed no signs it was wavering. The EU now acknowledging the setback to 6 decades of European integration and predicting a bumpy exit negotiation process, which is expected to take at least 2 years.
There is no reason to pretend that this is a happy day, neither in Brussels nor in London.
The announcement comes 9 months after the UK voted to leave the EU. Markets around the world were rattled by the vote, and the pound lost significant ground to the strengthening dollar. But so far, the response to Article 50 has been fairly tame, with investors taking a wait-and-see approach while the negotiation process plays out.
Theresa May has already outlined the fact that we cannot make our own trade agreements inside the single market. How that position evolves will dictate how successful a Brexit will be.
Scottish voters who backed Europe in last year's vote could hold a new referendum on independence. If that passes, Scotland could apply for its own EU membership. In London, Greg Palcott, Fox News.